All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday evening program from Dhammadharini Monastery, and I'm Thāvirā Bhikkhuni. And so this evening, the the Bhikkhunis of Dhammadharini and the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis all over the world have just entered the Vassa. For those who are observing first Vassa, just entered Vassa with the last full moon. And so this evening, we're just having a little opportunity to reflect and learn a bit more about that, and both kind of talk about some of the practicalities of how we observe the Vassa and how the Buddha set up this container for us to practice in. And then also to just have some reflections about kind of why this is set up the way it is, and the wisdom of the Buddha in establishing this way of practice, and what we can learn from that, whether we are monastics or not. I think there's a lot that's applicable to our practice for all of us. So to start with, we're going to have about 40 minutes of guided meditation. So I just invite everyone to prepare yourself for the meditation, and find yourself in a comfortable posture as much as you can, if you can remove distractions from your environment. So let your body become still. And then once you've found some stillness in the body, invite the inner currents of your body and mind to also become still. So often we're so much in motion that doesn't come to a stop right away, but at least start inviting some stillness. So feel where your body is supported by the earth. And really feel the solidity and the stillness of the earth beneath you. And then from that stable foundation, just check in with your posture. Feel your spine upright and balanced and relaxed. Whether you're sitting on a cushion or in a chair, you can still have your spine kind of straight and upright, so you're feeling both alert and also relaxed. And then check in with your breath and just ask, how can it be more comfortable and more at ease? And it might feel like there's a lot going on in the body and mind right now, and that's okay. And maybe it's not easeful, and that's also okay. But just really look for every little shift towards more stillness and really welcome that. So, as monastics for the Vassa, we make a commitment to stay in one place. So, just ask yourself, can I commit to staying with this body and mind for this time of meditation? And just with curiosity, can I just stay here and see what's here? And whatever is here right now, ask yourself if there can be a little bit of stillness in how you're being with it. Even if it's restlessness or agitation, is there some part of you that is quiet and calm and still? And can you rest there? When we bring ourselves to more stillness, we can begin to see more clearly. So see if any space begins to open up and if anything begins to clarify as you come into more stillness. During the Vassa, we also make a commitment to keep our precepts. This way of life and practice that the Buddha laid out for us. So let your heart feel the safety that comes from living with restraint. And living with restraint and keeping these precepts also brings clarity. Whether you're keeping 5 or 8 or the 311 precepts of a bhikkhuni, these allow the heart to feel light and clean and simple, and allow us to live without regret. And remember, we can always choose. So even if we did something different in the past, we can always now choose what is true and kind and skillful. Vassa is also a time of adhitthana, of determination. It's a time to renew and deepen our commitment to our path, to our training of ourselves, and to this practice that leads us to our own happiness. So reflect for yourself. What are my skillful qualities that I wish to deepen and strengthen? And reflect for yourself, what are my less skillful qualities that I'd like to loosen my grip on and learn to let go of? And remember that when we make a determination, it doesn't need to be about perfection and keeping it perfectly and never slipping up. But it can be about setting a direction for ourselves. What direction do I want to move in? And then let that determination, that intention, let it settle into your heart where it can look for opportunities to grow and to express itself. So let's sit together quietly now for about 10 more minutes and keep these things in your heart. How can stillness bring more clarity? How can restraint and kindness and keeping the precepts bring more lightness in your heart? And how can we use our determination to move us in the direction we want to go in? Bring yourself back to the breath if you've gone away. And bring yourself back to this body, resting here on the earth. May this time of stillness be a blessing. May we choose restraint in a way that leads us to freedom. And may our determination lead us on to awakening. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, good evening, everyone. Welcome again. So, as I said at the beginning, this evening we're going to be reflecting a bit about the Vassa. And this is Vassa means rains, and it's the 3-month time of retreat and of more kind of constrained practice that the bhikkhus and the bhikkhunis observe. And so this evening will be a combination of some kind of, practical, grounded sharing about how exactly we keep the Vassa and the way the Buddha set that up for us. And not a lot of detail about Vinaya, but just to give you a sense of, in practice, how do we actually keep the Vassa and what does that look like? And then also to have some reflection on the benefits and why the Buddha set this up the way that he did. And, we're using these rules that the Buddha established to guide our lives. And so, what is the actual effect on us of living with those rules? And obviously this is very practical and, part of our daily lives for the monastics, but also I think it's applicable to everyone. And I think there are things in this that can apply to anyone's practice, lay or monastic. And I think there's something that's really beautiful about the Vinaya in that it's taking our commitment to our practice, which can be this kind of a vague, amorphous goal, like I want to be enlightened. And, it's making it really practical down to this very low level of detail. And, what does it look like to follow those and how can those help us really see ourselves clearly? And, rather than having just this kind of vague aspiration, how do I really assess myself? Like how am I actually doing with respect to this path that the Buddha established for us? And, I want to say I'm not a expert on any of this, so I'm now entering just this last full moon. I've entered my second Vassa formally as a Bhikkhuni, and it's my seventh Vassa living with the Dhammadharini community. So I've had a bit of experience of being here and observing and living within this form. And, if you ask me again 20 years from now, I might have totally different reflections on this, but, I can share kind of what I've experienced and what I've seen so far. So first of all, the basics, what actually is the Vassa? So as I said, Vassa means the rainy season, and this is the monsoon season in India, which in California is the dry fire season. I know in some communities they might choose to observe Vassa, like Shravasti Abbey, I think, observes their retreat time in the winter there, which is a little more aligned with the climate. But we are choosing to observe it faithfully as the Buddha set up for us. And it's scheduled based on the lunar calendar, which, when translated to the Western calendar, is usually from the day after the full moon of July until the full moon of October. And so the most obvious thing about Vassa is that for these 3 months, the bhikkhus and the bhikkhunis make a commitment that they will stay in one place. At the time of the Buddha, the monastics were homeless wanderers and wandering from place to place. And, for these 3 months, they commit to staying in one place. And let me show you as probably many of you know, every rule laid down by the Buddha has an origin story. So he started with no rules. And then, as there were monks misbehaving and people complaining in various ways, the Buddha started to establish rules. And so this is the origin story for the establishment of the Vassa. At one time, the Buddha was staying at Rajagaha in the bamboo grove, the squirrel sanctuary. At that time, the Buddha had not yet laid down the rainy season residence for the monks. And so the monks were wandering about in the winter, in the summer, and also during the rainy season. People complained and criticized them. How can the Shakyan monastics go wandering in the winter, in the summer, and even during the rainy season? They're trampling down the green grass, oppressing one-sensed life, and destroying many small creatures. Even the monastics of other religions, with their flawed teachings, settle down for the rainy season. Even birds make a nest in the top of a tree and settle down for the rainy season, but not so the Shakyan monastics. So as with many Vinaya rules, they start with someone complaining. And so based on this, the Buddha laid down the rule that we are to stay in one place for those 3 months of the rainy season. And so there's an offense, a pachitya, which requires confession, an offense for us if we go wandering during the Vassa. And there's an offense if we don't enter the Vassa at all. Not a very heavy offense, but still. And so this is an important part of our practice. And, I think the rules of the Vassa, they define a really clear container for us for those 3 months. And, it's a container in terms of time and of place and of our companions. So I find this idea of a container really valuable. The place that we spend our time and the people that we're with, really it defines so much about what our experience will be. And you can think about any container, any vessel, it keeps certain things in and it keeps certain things out. and then it defines the shape of the contents. And so as we think about how we're structuring our lives and what we're surrounding ourselves with and what limits we're placing on ourselves, this really, to a large degree, is what defines the contents of our minds and our hearts. And, in this case, we're making this space and we're defining its boundaries. And then we're committing ourselves to say, okay, we're going to practice with this for this period of time. And any time that we place constraints on ourselves, then we can learn something about ourselves, right? So we're not letting the mind wander anywhere at once, and we're setting limits for it. And then when it comes up against those limits, we can really actually see what's there in the mind. When the mind is sort of in a free, open space and can wander wherever it wants, there's this way that we can get, I think, an unrealistic sense of what's there. It's easy to feel like we're completely peaceful and completely equanimous as long as we're allowed to do anything we want, right? But then when we start setting limits, you can say like, oh no, when I come up against this thing, I'm not as equanimous as I thought I was. And so there's this way that it lets us see, kind of not what we imagine the mind is like, or hope the mind is like, but actually really, start to see ourselves clearly. We have, as we kind of move through our lives, we have all of these strategies, for how we keep ourselves in balance. And, we may set limits on ourselves, whether that's the precepts, whether that's living in a monastery, whether that's, in our case, taking many more precepts, 311 precepts of a bhikkhuni. We're cutting off access to some of the strategies we might have used. And, how do we cope with that? Right, so, some discomfort arises, whether that's something coming internally or something impacting us from the outside. And, maybe in the past we would have, run off to some, really unskillful strategy. Maybe we would have said, I'm uncomfortable with this situation, I need to lie about it. Maybe we would have said, I'm uncomfortable, I need to seek an intoxicant. And maybe it's something a little bit less, it's not breaking the 5 precepts, but maybe it's, something's uncomfortable, I need to go watch Netflix or distract myself. So when we, or in the case of a bhikkhuni, it's, the morning time and I'm interested to eat that thing, I sort of want to distract myself or want to escape some discomfort by eating something, but that food item hasn't been offered, so I can't. So when we cut off our usual strategy for dealing with that, then what do we do, right? So we have, throughout our lives, we've developed, when something we're uncomfortable with arises, we have a strategy for how we cope with it, how we get ourselves back in balance, how we escape that discomfort. And so when something happens like that, do we run away? Or do we learn to train ourselves to really stay long enough with it that we then start to have new ideas? So not just our old habitual, the thing that arises, the thing that we've been doing since we were teenagers, not just that habitual strategy, but how do we actually stay with it long enough that we can start to develop something new and develop some new way of coping with it? And when you're in the monastery or on a retreat, we've placed ourselves with these constraints, and we're surrounding ourselves with the teachings of the Buddha. So we can say, okay, when this thing comes up, how did the Buddha recommend that I handle this? And, I think it's so interesting to see, I like to look for those turning points where, you know, something will come up and you can really see it come down to this really small, very practical point of like, I didn't know how to apply this teaching, or, I can see my mind going into this very habitual pattern, and I can see my mind, creating this story the way it always has. And then there can be this point where it's like, you can say, okay, you know, there's a part of me that feels like I have to choose the story I've always chosen. And there's also a part of me that's like, no, maybe I can actually choose something different. And I think those little tiny decision points that can be really small, they can be just, I'm tired and I'm frustrated, and there's a part of me that's like, okay, I'm in this story of tiredness and frustration, and feeling like there's something important about that, and I have to keep holding on to that story, and the only way I can be okay is if I sort of let that story be satisfied. And then you can say like, no, like maybe actually, can I choose something that's just a little bit softer, or bring in something that's just like a little more quiet and still, and let myself meet the situation with that. And even if it's very small, I think every little shift like that, I think is really important. And I think when we place constraints on ourselves, when we put ourselves in a container, it gives us more opportunities to come up to those decision points. And for me, I think that's really something that I find really exciting about that. Of like, okay, like the actual points where you can really make change in the mind. How do you give yourself more opportunity for those? And so, for the Vassa, we're defining this container for ourselves really clearly and intentionally. And, we're doing it in a way that follows the wisdom of the Buddha. So otherwise, for maybe if we're not following any of the Buddhist precepts, where are the constraints on our behavior coming from, right? So for many people, it might be more like, when I run out of money, I have to stop pursuing pleasures, or, what will get me arrested, or what will my neighbor judge me for, right? So instead, what does it look like to give ourselves these boundaries, but do it based on the wisdom of an enlightened being who is trying to lead us to our greatest possible happiness? And I think it's helpful to consider, when we kind of look at the way the Buddha set up the rules for the Vassa, just how specific they are. And, we can appreciate the benefit of having this real like focus and definition, and not sort of leaving things vague and undefined. There can be a way that sometimes when we don't want to define something, when we don't want to define its borders, it's because some part of us is trying to leave ourselves an out. Our minds are very sneaky and resourceful in finding ways to maintain their old strategies, and they can sort of want to like leave things vague so that there's a little bit of like intentional ignorance there, right? That's like, okay, how can I leave myself an out? So I didn't exactly say that I wasn't going to do this. So when I go ahead and do it anyway, I haven't really broken, my promise, But so how can we really like say, how can we set really specific and clear boundaries for ourselves so that we really know whether or not we're meeting them? And of course, there's also the challenge that we can set limits for ourselves in a way that's so strict that it's unrealistic. And, I think everyone is familiar with the problem of New Year's resolutions, where, people make a resolution to go to the gym every day or whatever, and then can't stick with it. And then, that's demoralizing, right? If we've if we've made a determination and it's actually too strict and it's unrealistic and it's not what we're able to do right now. And on one hand, you want it to be strong enough that it's actually meaningful and can actually produce change in our lives, but not so strict that we can't keep it, and then we feel like we can't trust ourselves, and it's demoralizing. So we'll see when I talk a little more about the specific guidelines for the Vassa. The Buddha is very specific in some ways and very clear, and also there is some flexibility and there's some ability to adapt to conditions as they actually arise. So in defining the Vassa, there's definition of the time and the place and our companions. So really the most fundamental definition of the Vassa is about the time. It's named the rains after the rainy season in India, and it's this 3-month period. And so as I was saying, there's this way when we're trying to define constraints for ourselves, we're looking at, how strict can it be? And then how long are we asking ourselves to remain inside this container? And if it's too strict, then something may come up that we just don't have the resources or the skills to deal with within that container, within those limits that we've set for ourselves. But if it's too loose, then there's not that benefit that it doesn't help us come up against limits in a way that's useful and helps us actually enable our own transformation. And with anything, the longer we commit to it, the more restrictive it may feel, right? So it's good to be a bit smart about how strict the container is and how long we establish it for ourselves. So if you're normally living with the 5 precepts, then you might choose to keep the 8 precepts 1 day a week. That's very common in some places. It may be that, if you're just starting to do retreats, you might want to do a weekend retreat before you do a week-long retreat. You probably want to do several week-long retreats before you commit to a 3-month retreat. So we're really looking at how do I define this container that I'm practicing in, and really recognize that the benefit of that is you are trying to develop new skills for handling things. So you've limited yourself, so you're not able to apply your old strategies, and but you do need to then learn those new skills. And if we do that really gradually in a way that's sort of within our capacity to develop those skills, then we can really gain confidence, and we can learn to trust ourselves that we can handle what comes up. Certainly for me, there was a long process of, starting off with weekend retreats and then week-long retreats, and then visiting a monastery for a short time, and then visiting a monastery for a longer time. And, there's like kind of going in and out of those stricter situations, and, developing the confidence and the trust in ourselves that says, no, I actually can develop enough of a skill set that I can handle what comes up without needing to resort to my old strategies. But it's good if we do that kind of slowly and gradually and realistically about our own capacity. And so for the case of Vassa, we have the benefit of following the guidelines of the Buddha, and we keep this for 3 months. And so we also define a place. So we commit to staying in one place. And, for us at Dhammadharini, actually all of our Bhikkhunis have entered Vassa at our Aranyabodhi hermitage. And we actually define that space, the hermitage is quite large. And so we're actually defining that space very specifically. So I can show you, we have a map. So we have our our map that we've drawn here. This is our hand-drawn map of our hermitage property, and our green boundary there is the boundary of our Vassa. And then for the Bhikkhunis, anytime that we leave that boundary, we actually recite this text here. So if there are no obstacles for us, we shall return within 7 days. So when we drove out of that green boundary this afternoon, the Bhikkhunis in the car all recited that. So there's, obviously it's very specific for us, but, for you, you might say, okay, I'm going on a retreat and I commit that I'm going to stay on the retreat property for the time of the retreat. Um, or, for example, when I did the 3-month retreat at Insight Meditation Society, I learned afterwards that there were people who were walking into town for ice cream. So, will you commit to really staying within the limits you've set for yourself? And you can see for the Vassa, we establish this boundary very specifically, and then we're very clear about acknowledging when we are crossing that boundary. And I think there's something really, again, about having clarity and definition and not leaving things vague. I know exactly where I am with respect to that boundary. And we also choose our companions for the time of the Vassa. So because the Bhikkhunis make a commitment to stay in one place for the Vassa, and we don't want to break that ourselves, and we don't want to encourage anyone else to break it. We know that we're kind of stuck with each other for the 3 months. So it's pretty common for monastics to travel and spend the Vassa in other communities. So right now at Dhammadharini, we have 4 visiting Bhikkhunis and 1 visiting Sikamana, kind of novice. And so they're here with us just for the Vassa. And the community and the people we're spending our time with really, it defines so much about our experience. And so it's good to choose our companions wisely. So for us, we have a trial period before the Vassa for anyone who hasn't stayed with us before, that before we commit to entering the Vassa with someone new, we have time with them beforehand just to make sure it's going to work out well enough. And it's kind of interesting that 3 months there's something I think special about having at least that much time with people, it's enough time for a group to really kind of get like settled together as a group. It's long enough that you kind of are past the initial honeymoon period where everyone gets along perfectly, and you do have issues that start to come up between the different people. But it's also long enough that there's a feeling of a commitment to actually working through those issues, because you have more time together. And, for people who are coming together who might be almost complete strangers at the beginning, it's really special to actually be living together with people in a community for that long. And, a group that spends the Vassa together really kind of develops strength together as a group. And it develops really strong relationships that then last beyond Vassa. And I think, because monastics do often travel and spend time in different communities for the Vassa, it really creates this strengthening of relationships throughout the Sangha. And, for us, it turns into this really kind of international network of relationships with other monastics. And I just think a lot about, how the Buddha set these things up to strengthen his Sangha and to preserve the teachings in the world. And I feel like this is very much part of that, to have this sense of this bigger community beyond just maybe the small number of people you ordained with, but to have these relationships throughout the Sangha. They really make it feel like, beyond just one community or one country, that's really, this international network of people who are trying to keep these teachings alive in the world and live them. And obviously that an essential part of us entering Vassa is having the support to do so. So it's common for a group of supporters to invite monastics to spend the Vassa in a particular place and then commit to supporting them. And people do this because they think the practice of Vassa is beneficial, for all the reasons we've been talking about, and people want to support it. And also people find benefit in having monastics nearby and getting to spend time with them. And for us, we have this enormous benefit of being able to live our lives in a way that's really blameless and beneficial for ourselves and others. And I think for all of us, monastics and non-monastics, it's good to really consider, when our actions are really skillful and beneficial, then we ourselves feel that, and other people feel it too. And people want to be close to that and want to support it, and then sort of be able to join in the benefit of that. And I think there's a lot of cynicism and a lot of harm being done in the world. But, how can we kind of attune ourselves instead to this, to these things that are wholesome? And, both what we're doing that's wholesome and what other people are doing that's wholesome. And how can we really think about like supporting one another in that? And so we've talked about the time and the place and the companions and the support. So a little bit about, just again, to give you a little bit of practical, concrete example, let's look at, what are the actual rituals that define Vassa? So we have, as I mentioned, we have people who commit to supporting the Vassa. And so that is represented by the Vassa Aradhana. And so this is the ceremony that we had just, Sunday, July 6th. We have our wonderful supporters who have committed to supporting the Dhammadharini Bhikkhunis for Vassa and then offering Katina. And also the board of directors. We had a representative of the board of directors who also is very much owns the properties and is very much part of our support. And so there was just a short text recited that says, we invite and support the Bhikkhunis for this time of Vassa. And then when the Bhikkhunis actually enter the Vassa on the day after the full moon, we have the Vassa Adhitthana. And so this is the Vassa determination. And so you can see a picture here of us with the 8 Bhikkhunis entering Vassa together at Aranya Bodhi here in the yurt, actually very late at night. So doing that ceremony together. And it's very simple, again, we just recite a short Pali text that says, we enter the rains in this Aranya Bodhi residence for 3 months. And so I really appreciate these things are, they're just very simple and very straightforward. So the other really important ritual of Vassa is the Pavarana, which comes at the end, which I will talk about soon. But first to talk about, okay, so we've set up these constraints and we've made this determination to live within these constraints for these 3 months. And this is beneficial for all these reasons that we've talked about. But also the Buddha did allow, exceptions and flexibility that lets us actually work with conditions as they arrive. So when we've set these limits for ourselves, it's how can we be skillful about, when should I really be super strict with myself and when does it make sense to be a little more flexible? And, how can we be honest with ourselves about, are we being flexible for good reasons, skillful reasons? Or is this my mind being sneaky and trying to, be unskillful? So again, for the Vassa, we have the benefit of the Buddha's guidance. And, if I like to look at this as if everything that the Buddha has set up in Vinaya is about strengthening the Sangha and supporting our practice and preserving these teachings in the world, when does some flexibility actually support that strength? I think it's good to look at that. So one exception is that we are allowed to go out for certain allowable reasons, go out of our Vassa boundary for up to 7 days. And in the origin story for this, a supporter comes to the monks and invites them to go somewhere that he wants to make an offering and hear the teachings. And the monks refuse because they've made this determination to stay in one place. And the supporter criticizes them and said, I'm here to support, and why are you refusing? So they ask the Buddha, and the Buddha allows them to travel for this short period of time. And there's a whole list of reasons that are considered allowable. And these are things like a donor is wanting to make offerings to the Sangha and request teachings. So this is the allowance on which I am here at the monastery right now for this week. And also to help care for and support other members of the Sangha if they're sick or if they're needing encouragement or in danger of falling away from the training. There's also supporting Sangha legal procedures related to clearing offenses or official procedures per Vinaya. Also participating in ordination. Also visiting your parents. So some parents of monastics know if they invite us during Vassa, when we are supposed to go visit them if we can. So it's interesting to look at, all of these things are about strengthening the Sangha, strengthening our upholding of the Vinaya, strengthening our relationship with our families, with our supporters, with the lay community. So even though we've established this strict rule to stay in one place, these different places where the Buddha said, no, actually for these reasons, it actually is beneficial to have some flexibility. And also there are reasons that we're allowed to break the Vassa and have it not be an offense. And so these are, basically if the place you've committed to stay for the Vassa becomes dangerous or unsuitable, due to criminals or dangerous animals or fire or flooding, or if you're not getting support for the requisites, or if the people who are supporting you move somewhere else, you're allowed to follow them. Also, there's a list of if there is something that comes into your environment that you think will be overly tempting and is a danger to your monastic life. If you're being tempted by a woman, a king, by relatives, by criminals or scoundrels, or if you see an ownerless treasure. So, if you've entered Vassa too close to your relatives and they are trying to convince you to leave monastic life, then that is an allowable reason to break Vassa without it being an offense. Or also, if there's danger of a schism in the Sangha and you want to either leave to avoid being a part of that, or if you want to travel somewhere else to help prevent a schism, those are reasons that the Buddha allowed us to leave Vassa without it being an offense. But assuming you have not been excessively tempted by any of those things, and you do make it to the end of Vassa, we then have the Pavarana. And, so it's good anytime we define a container for ourselves and we experience what it's like to live within that, and we learn what we can about ourselves. And, we come to the end, and it's then good to assess, how did it go? So the final ritual that defines the end of Vassa is Pavarana, and that means invitation. So we've lived together with these companions for 3 months, and basically we just invite them to give us feedback. So the Buddha said, when you have completed the rainy season residence, you should invite the monks to correct you in regard to 3 things. What has been seen, heard, or suspected. This will help you live with one another in the proper way, help you clear yourself of offenses, and help you prioritize the training. So for bhikkhunis, we offer Pavarana first to the bhikkhunis who we spent the Vassa with, and we do that on the full moon Uposatha that defines the end of Vassa. This is actually the one Uposatha day when we do not recite the Patimokkha. Our observance for that day is the Pavarana. And then after that, the bhikkhunis also offer Pavarana to the bhikkhus. We go to the Bhikkhu Sangha and request their feedback. And this is another benefit of spending time with a consistent group of people together, is that we really have time to observe one another. And, the real benefit of living in community is, there are things that are really hard to see about ourselves and, places we may not be seeing ourselves clearly. And so this is a chance to invite those who've been with us to tell us maybe what they're seeing that we're not. And noting this happens on the very last day, so everyone can leave the day after, and so maybe people are more likely to be honest. But I think the Buddha understood that our minds are really sneaky, and he set up these systems of feedback to help us train ourselves. But then also on the other side, if you spent Vasa together and someone suspects or knows something and they don't bring it up at Pavarana, then that's an offense for them if they bring it up later. So there's this way of really like bringing this container to a really clear closure and kind of settling everything with one another. And upon the completion of Pavarana, that's when your Vasa Adhitthana is completed. So you've made this determination for the time of the Vasa, and once you've completed your Pavarana, you've then satisfied it. And then after Vasa, we've talked a lot about this benefit of having stability and having containment. But then actually when we reach the end of Vasa, there's a rule that we are required to go on a journey. So I think that's important, to recognize this other side of it, that there's value both in stability and also in going out and exposing ourselves to new things and having new experiences. And this also supports our practice, so really recognizing the benefit of moving between those two things. Right. So that brings us to the end of Vasa and what I had to say about that. And yeah, welcoming if anyone has comments or questions. I can allow you to unmute yourself if you'd like. Welcome to unmute yourself or raise your digital hand if you have any comments or questions or thoughts. Okay, Daniel.
Uh, yes, thank you so much. I appreciate this. The Vasa kind of practice is a little new to me, as I'm pretty familiar with like Mahayana practice, but much less with Theravada practice. How does the sort of day-to-day practice during Vasa differ from monastic life outside the Vasa? So obviously there's stability, you stay in one
Mhm.
place, but is the schedule different or the practices different? Does it vary from place to place? In my head, conceptually, I'm thinking of like Lent, right? Where it's like
Mhm.
this period where it's like more intense spiritual practice. And I know, this isn't Catholicism, but yeah, I guess that's kind of where I'm going, and I'm wondering if there's a difference in practice.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's um, that aspect is not defined for us by Vinaya, so different communities handle that differently. So for us, I think in some places it is true secluded retreat for the time of Vasa. I think Bodhinyana, Ajahn Brahm's monastery is that way. For us, it's more a time of kind of community training. So we have 10 monastics with us right now from all over the world, and we're really focusing on training together as a group. And we're doing intensive Vinaya training with Ayatthha at the Hermitage. And so for us, it's really about, coming together with this really diverse Sangha and training together and practicing together. And, we may have short periods of retreat during that, but it's much more about this kind of community learning together. But yeah, I think that part is not defined by Vinaya, so it can be different between different communities. But yeah, it's a good question.
No, that makes sense. Thank you, Venerable.
Yeah. Uh, Chintana.
I just wanted to say I learned much tonight. Thank you very much, Bhikkhuni Thavira. And it's been really great to see you.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, well, we realize, we talk about these things and we mention them, and even people who may have spent a lot of time around monastics might not know these more specifics. So thinking it's helpful to share. Oh, Richard.
Thank you, Aya. You just said that you're doing intensive Vinaya training with Aya Tattaloka. What do you mean exactly by intensive Vinaya training? I'm just curious by that.
Well, we're just beginning, but the way it has been in previous years is that it's often, you know, multi-hour classes together, multiple days a week. So, often long sessions, spending time. And it very much depends on who the group is and sort of what their level of knowledge is, what we need to focus on. But it's, spending hours together talking about the rules and, how we live with them in practice and learning how to make sure everyone has the independence to know how to answer questions themselves and, look things up when they have questions about them and, getting familiar with the texts that define this and it's a long, slow process and there's a lot to learn, but, just getting everyone as comfortable as we can with it. And she's very patient with us to to be able to spend the time together to, just take her decades of knowledge and be willing to share it with the next generation, as we really very much appreciate.
Right. So you mean like memorizing the rules or memorizing the stories around the rules or both?
Yeah, not
I'm not
necessarily
100%
about
clear.
memorization, but about how do you,
Familiarizing yourself with
yeah,
it.
familiarizing yourself, when a question comes up, how do you answer it? What are the things that are clearly defined? What are the things that different communities need to sort of define the detail of themselves? What's that process? And obviously, there was a long time when no one was living with the Bhikkhuni Vinaya, and so, how do we put it into practice in a way that is both that is liberating, right? That's not overly restrictive, and not too loose. So really kind of talking through that together and what that looks like. And, in some cases, we may have a group of monastics who has, less familiarity and less education and needs a little more basic training. And in some cases, it may be a group that is able to get into more advanced details, but it depends on who's together. But really trying to make everyone feel really, empowered to hold these rules ourselves and to live within them in a way that is really like internalized and integrated. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. We just about come to the end of our time. I'd like to turn it over to Paula.
Hi, everybody. So, closing announcements for tonight. Thank you so much, Venerable. Just going to share my screen. Okay. So, we have some upcoming special events. Coming up the weekend of August 9th and 10th is Dhammadharini's 20th anniversary celebration. There will be more information on all of these things in your inbox very soon. There's also a movie night coming up, streaming of the film honoring the life of Mahajapati Gotami, presented by the Dhammadharini Support Foundation. We're also deep in planning a September in-person retreat, and there'll be more information on that coming soon as well. Volunteer opportunities. There are always opportunities to volunteer and help out. There are positions on the board of directors and also a committee, and there are also one-off opportunities to also help out. So that is all on the website. So you can help out online and you can also help out in person. And can always support the Bhikkhunis during Vassa and other times as well. So there's all kinds of ways to support with offering a meal, offering requisites, and that is on the Dhammadharini Support Foundation as well. And so all of that information is also available on the website. So thank you very much, and I'll send it back over to you stop the sharing and back to you.
All right. Thank you, Paula. All right. Let's pay respects to the Triple Gem. Arahang Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddhang Bhagavantang Abhivademi Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammang namasami. Supatipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho sanghang namami. All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you,